There is a type of person you have encountered at some point in your life. Maybe you couldn't name what it was about them at the time. Maybe you just felt it, that particular quality of stillness they carry into a room, the way their presence changes the temperature of a conversation without them having to raise their voice, the way they seem completely unmoved by things that would send most people spiraling. You've seen this person get criticized and not flinch. You've watched someone try to provoke them and come away looking foolish. You've seen them receive news good or bad and respond with a calm that felt almost unsettling to everyone watching. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you filed them away under a category you didn't have a precise word for. That word is disciplined. But not disciplined in the shallow, surface-level way most people mean it when they talk about waking up early or not eating sugar. Disciplined in the deepest, most fundamental sense of the word. Disciplined in the way that has nothing to do with a morning routine and everything to do with who you are in the moments that actually count. Here is the paradox that almost no one talks about honestly. The most disciplined people in the world are not people who feel less. They are people who feel more. They feel anger more intensely than most. They feel fear more acutely. They feel pain, frustration, humiliation, longing, grief, all of it with a depth that would surprise the people who observe them from the outside and mistake their composure for coldness. The difference is not in the volume of the emotion. The difference is in what happens between the moment the emotion arrives and the moment a response is chosen. And that gap, that space between feeling and reacting is where everything important happens. That space is where character is built. That space is what separates the person who owns their life from the person who is owned by their circumstances. This is a script about that space, about why most people never develop it, about what it actually costs you when you live without it, about the specific lies the culture has told you about what discipline and emotional control are supposed to look like, and about how to build from the ground up the kind of internal architecture that allows you to feel everything while being controlled by nothing. This is not a script about becoming emotionless. It is not a guide to suppression. It is not a blueprint for becoming cold, robotic, or disconnected. It is the opposite of all of that. It is a map back to something older and more powerful than anything the modern world has tried to sell you. It is a map back to mastery over yourself. And the journey begins where it always begins, not with a technique, not with a habit, not with a morning ritual, but with understanding exactly what is happening inside you and exactly why the untrained version of that process is quietly costing you everything. Chapter 1. The paradox no one talks about. The first thing you need to understand is that everything you have been taught about emotional strength is probably wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not off by a small margin. Wrong in a way that has likely caused you to build your entire internal life on a foundation that will collapse the moment real pressure is applied. Here is what most people believe. They believe that the emotionally strong person is the one who doesn't feel much. They believe discipline means a kind of inner numbness. They believe that the person who keeps their composure does so because they have somehow switched off the part of themselves that generates emotional responses. And they believe that if they could just feel less, be less sensitive, less affected, less moved, they would finally become the kind of person they are trying to be. This belief is understandable. It comes from watching disciplined people from the outside and drawing the wrong conclusion from what you observe. When you watch someone receive criticism without breaking down, your brain assumes they didn't feel it. When you watch someone stay calm under enormous pressure, you assume the pressure didn't affect them. When you watch someone absorb a provocation without reacting, you assume they weren't provoked. None of those assumptions are accurate. In fact, they are almost always completely false. The most disciplined people in the world feel things profoundly. This is not a minor detail. This is the central truth of this entire script. Elite performers in every field, athletes who compete at the highest level, executives who operate in environments of extreme pressure, soldiers who function in conditions that would break most people, artists who create work that moves the world. These are people with enormous emotional sensitivity. They feel the weight of competition before it begins. They feel the sting of failure sharply and completely. They feel fear before difficult things in a way that is entirely real, entirely physical, entirely present. The difference is not that they feel less. The difference is that they have developed a relationship with their feelings that most people never develop. They have learned to be aware of what is happening inside them without being at the mercy of it. They have built what you might think of as a kind of internal distance, not a wall, not a barrier, not a suppression mechanism, but a space, a gap, a moment of awareness that exists between the arrival of a feeling and the choice about what to do with it. That gap is everything. Without it, you are not a person who is living your life. You are a pinball being knocked around by whatever the world throws at you. Every comment lands and you react. Every setback hits and you collapse. Every provocation finds you and you respond not from wisdom, not from intention, not from your values, but from pure reflex. And reflex is just another word for someone else's control over your behavior. Think about what that actually means for your life. Think about the number of times you said something you later regretted, not because you intended to say it, not because it reflected what you actually believed or valued, but because a feeling arrived and you let it speak before you could decide whether you wanted it to. Think about the decisions you've made in moments of anger that you spent weeks or months recovering from. Think about the relationships that have been damaged not by any deliberate act on your part, but by a reflexive response to something you were feeling in a moment when you were least equipped to handle it well. Now think about the alternative. Think about what it would look like to feel all of that. The anger, the fear, the frustration, the hurt, and then make a choice. Not suppress the feeling. Not pretend it isn't there. Not perform composure for an audience, but actually choose. Choose what to do with what you feel. Choose whether this moment requires a response at all. Choose whether the feeling that just arrived is worth acting on, or whether it is simply information data about your inner state that you can acknowledge, note, and decide does not require you to do anything in particular right now. This is the paradox. Feeling everything and reacting to nothing. Not because you are cold, not because you don't care, but because you have developed something rare enough in this world that most people go their entire lives without it. You have developed the ability to be present to your experience without being consumed by it. You have developed the internal architecture of someone who is not at the mercy of circumstances. You have developed, in the deepest and most real sense of the word, discipline. The question this script is going to answer is how. How do you develop that gap? How do you build that space? What does it actually take, day by day, and decision by decision, to become the kind of person who feels everything but reacts to nothing? But before we get to the how, we need to spend some time with the why. And the most important dimension of the why is not the benefit of developing this capacity. It is the cost of failing to develop it, because most people will not make a change until they fully understand what the absence of that change is taking from them. Chapter 2. What reactivity is really costing you? You have heard the phrase before, that it is not the emotion itself, but what you do with it that matters. You have probably nodded when you heard it. You may have even believed it. But belief is not the same as understanding. And understanding is not the same as living the principle in a way that changes your actual behavior. So let us get specific. Let us talk about what reactivity is actually costing you. Not in abstract terms, not in philosophical language, but in the concrete, measurable, daily texture of your life. The first cost is relational. Every relationship you have, romantic, professional, familial, social, is shaped in significant part by how you respond to friction. Friction is unavoidable in any relationship that involves two real people with real needs, real histories, and real differences. What matters is not whether friction occurs. It is what happens when it does. And in most cases, in most people's relationships, what happens is reactive. Someone says something that lands wrong, and the other person responds from that feeling. Someone does something that triggers an old wound, and the response comes from the wound rather than from any deliberate choice. Someone challenges or criticizes or disappoints, and the reaction is not thought through, but felt through. And what comes out of that feeling is often something that makes the situation worse rather than better. Over time, this pattern does enormous damage, not in a single dramatic incident, usually, in the slow accumulation of thousands of small reactive moments, in the way the other person learns to brace themselves around you, in the way trust erodes, when someone realizes that your responses are unpredictable, that they can't bring certain things to you without triggering a defensive storm, that the version of you that shows up in moments of friction is not someone they fully trust. Relationships don't usually end in explosions. They end in the quiet decision that the exhaustion of dealing with someone's reactivity is no longer worth what the relationship provides. The second cost is professional. If you work in any environment with other people, your reactivity is something everyone around you has already noticed and is already factoring into how they interact with you. It is factored into whether they bring you their real ideas or their sanitized, safe ideas. It is factored into whether they advocate for you in rooms you're not in. It is factored into whether they trust you with high-stakes projects, or whether they quietly route those projects to someone who they believe can handle pressure without becoming a liability. People who react from emotion in professional settings are remembered that way. The brilliant presentation you gave 6 months ago fades. The moment you snapped in a meeting lives in people's memory longer than almost anything else you have done. The cost here is not just about impression management. It is about what reactivity signals. When you react defensively to criticism, you signal to everyone watching that your ego is bigger than your interest in growth. When you react angrily to setback, you signal that you lack the resilience that difficult challenges require. When you react impulsively in moments of high pressure, you signal that you cannot be trusted with more pressure than you are already carrying. These signals shape every decision that is made about you, and most of those decisions are made in your absence by people who are basing their assessment entirely on what they have observed in unguarded moments. The third cost is strategic. This one is perhaps the most underappreciated. When you react, you give away information. You reveal what bothers you, which tells people exactly where to apply pressure if they want to destabilize you. You reveal your priorities, your insecurities, your triggers. And once that information is out in the world, it is available to anyone who wants to use it. The most strategically dangerous thing you can do in any competitive environment is be predictable. And nothing makes you more predictable than a reactive pattern. The moment someone understands what will make you lose your composure, they own you. They don't need to be stronger than you or smarter than you. They just need to know your buttons and be willing to push them. The fourth cost is internal, and it is the deepest of all. When you are reactive, you are not fully in control of your own life. Think about what that actually means. Every day, the quality of your internal experience, whether you feel calm or agitated, confident or defensive, at peace or at war, with your own mind, is determined by what happens to you from the outside. A comment from a coworker can ruin your morning. A traffic jam can color your entire day. A message from the wrong person can send you into a spiral that lasts for hours. You are, in the most literal sense, at the mercy of your environment. You have outsourced the management of your inner state to the world around you, and the world is not a reliable caretaker. The person who has developed the gap, the space between feeling and reaction, is living a fundamentally different experience. Not a better life in terms of circumstances. Not a life without difficulty or pain or genuine challenge. A better life in terms of relationship to experience. The same traffic jam is just a traffic jam. The same critical comment is just information to consider. The same difficult message gets read, processed, and responded to with intention, rather than absorbed and allowed to poison the next 3 hours. The external circumstances are identical. The internal experience is completely different. And over the course of a life, that difference compounds in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. What reactivity costs you, in the end, is sovereignty. Sovereignty over your responses, your relationships, your reputation, your strategy, and your inner experience. It costs you the experience of being someone who actually lives their life, as opposed to someone who simply reacts to the life that happens around them. And when you understand the magnitude of that cost, really understand it, not intellectually, but in your gut, the question of whether to do the work required to build the alternative stops feeling optional. Chapter 3. The myth of the emotionless, disciplined person. Before we can build anything real, we need to tear down the structure that is in the way. And the structure that is most in the way, the belief that blocks more people from developing genuine emotional mastery than almost anything else, is the myth of the emotionless, disciplined person. This myth is everywhere. It is in the way discipline is portrayed in almost every cultural narrative that touches it. The stoic warrior who feels nothing. The cold executive who processes everything with the detachment of a machine. The Zen master who has transcended the messiness of human emotion and arrived at some elevated state of pure rationality. These archetypes are compelling. They look like strength. They feel like an aspiration. And they are almost entirely fictional, and pursuing them will lead you somewhere you do not want to go. Here is the problem with trying to become emotionless. Emotion is not a defect. It is not a bug in your programming that would ideally be patched out. It is a core feature of your cognition, your intuition, your creativity, your connection to other people, and your navigation of the world. Emotions carry information. The fear you feel before something difficult is information about risk. The anger you feel when your boundaries are crossed is information about what you value. The discomfort you feel when you are about to do something that conflicts with your integrity is information about who you are and who you are trying to be. Strip away the ability to feel these things, and you do not become more disciplined. You become less informed. You become less human. And you become precisely the kind of person who makes catastrophic decisions in high-stakes situations because they have lost access to the internal guidance system that emotion provides. The research on this is clear. Studies of people with damage to the emotional centers of their brain damage that significantly reduces their ability to feel emotional responses do not show people who become better decision-makers. They show people who become dramatically worse decision-makers. They get paralyzed by choices that should be easy. They lose the ability to weigh competing options in any useful way. They make decisions that, to any emotionally intact observer, are obviously wrong. Because decision-making is not a purely rational process, and it never has been. Emotion is not the enemy of good judgment. It is a necessary component of it. What discipline actually requires is not the elimination of feeling, but a different relationship with feeling. This distinction sounds simple. It is not. It requires a fundamental reorientation of how you think about what your emotions are and what they are for. Most people have one of two relationships with their emotions. Either they are led by them, the feeling arrives, and they follow it wherever it goes, reacting from it automatically and often destructively, or they are at war with them. They try to suppress, dismiss, or override their emotional responses through sheer force of will, which works for a while, and then fails spectacularly at the worst possible moment. Neither of these relationships produces genuine discipline. The first produces reactivity. The second produces brittleness, a kind of forced composure that looks like strength right up until the moment the pressure becomes sufficient to crack it open, at which point everything that has been suppressed comes out at once, in a way that is far more destructive than if it had been processed honestly in real time. Genuine discipline requires a third relationship. The relationship of the observer, the person who notices what they are feeling fully, honestly, without minimizing it, and then makes a choice about what to do with it. Not automatically led by it, not at war with it, but genuinely present to it, genuinely informed by it, and genuinely in charge of what happens next because of it. The myth of the emotionless, disciplined person is so dangerous precisely because it looks like a higher state. It looks like an aspiration worth moving toward. But people who pursue it discover, usually at great personal cost, that they have not become more disciplined. They have become more fragile, more disconnected from their own interior life, more prone to the kind of sudden, complete breakdown that occurs when suppressed material finally overwhelms the system trying to hold it down. They have not built a stronger inner world. They have built a more pressurized one, and pressurized systems, as any engineer will tell you, do not fail gracefully. They fail catastrophically. The person you actually want to become is not cold. They are warm and deeply capable of feeling. They laugh easily. They grieve fully when grief is called for. They feel joy in a way that is unguarded and real. They care deeply about things and are not ashamed of that depth of caring. What they have developed, what makes them look from the outside like someone who feels nothing, is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something in between the feeling and the reaction. A pause. a breath, a moment of observation, a question. Is this emotion asking me to do something useful right now, or is it simply letting me know something important about my inner state? That is the real model of emotional mastery. Not the warrior who feels nothing, but the person who feels everything and has learned to ask, in the moment that counts, what the feeling actually wants from them, and then to answer that question from their deepest values rather than from the raw pressure of the feeling itself. And here is the thing that makes this model not just more accurate but more powerful than the emotionless myth, feeling deeply, combined with the discipline to choose your response, makes you more effective in every domain that requires genuine human connection. You understand what other people are going through because you allow yourself to actually go there too. You make better judgments under pressure because your emotional intelligence is intact and feeding you accurate information. You inspire more trust in others because you are genuine. They can feel that you are real, that something of substance is actually happening inside you, that you are not performing a kind of manufactured calmness that could be punctured at any moment by sufficient provocation. The emotionless myth sells you a counterfeit version of strength. What this script is offering you is the real thing. And the real thing starts not with feeling less, but with understanding more specifically. Understanding what actually happens inside people who have developed genuine emotional mastery, and how what they experience is fundamentally different from what the myth suggests. Chapter 4. How elite performers actually experience emotion. If you spend any time studying the inner lives of people who perform at the highest levels of any demanding field, and researchers have spent a great deal of time doing exactly this, one of the most consistent findings is that elite performers do not experience less emotional activation than average performers. They often experience more. The difference is in what they do with that activation. Take the competitive athlete. The idea that elite athletes are calm before competition in the way that a person watching television is calm is almost universally false. What elite athletes describe, when asked honestly about their pre-competition experience, is something much closer to controlled intensity. Their heart rate is elevated. Their attention is heightened. Every sensation is slightly amplified. They are experiencing something that, in its physiological profile, is almost indistinguishable from anxiety. The difference between the elite athlete and the average competitor is not that the elite athlete doesn't feel this. It is that the elite athlete has developed a different interpretation of it. They have learned to recognize those physiological signals not as something to be afraid of, but as preparation, the body doing what it is designed to do when it is about to be asked to perform at its maximum. This is not a small distinction. It is everything, because the story you tell yourself about your internal state determines what your internal state does to your performance. The person who interprets pre-competition anxiety as evidence that something is wrong, that they are not prepared, that they cannot handle the situation, that they need to make it stop, is using their emotional activation against themselves. The person who interprets the same physiological state as evidence that their system is primed and ready is using it for themselves. Same emotion. Completely different outcome. The executive operating in a high-pressure business environment is another version of this. The idea that the most effective leaders are people who simply don't get rattled because the stakes don't affect them is a fantasy that doesn't survive contact with any serious leader's honest account of their experience. What high-performing leaders describe is a constant experience of genuine concern, genuine uncertainty, genuine weight, about the decisions they are making and the people they are responsible for. They feel the stakes. The difference is that they have developed the capacity to feel the stakes without letting that feeling become the operative force behind their decisions. They gather the information that the feeling contains. This matters. Get it right. The consequences of failure are real, without letting the feeling of pressure override the clarity needed to actually navigate the pressure well. This is the pattern you see across every elite performance domain. The surgeon who feels the weight of the responsibility every time they hold a scalpel, but whose hand is steady because that weight has been processed and placed somewhere useful, rather than allowed to translate directly into trembling. The military commander who experiences genuine fear in situations where fear is the only intelligent response, but who has trained to the point where the presence of fear does not prevent the clear thinking that the situation demands. The negotiator who feels the emotional pulls of the room, the pressure, the desire, the frustration in full and vivid detail, and uses that sensitivity to read what is actually happening while responding from something steadier than what they are feeling in the moment. What these people share is not emotional flatness. They share emotional sophistication, an unusually highly developed ability to be simultaneously present to their inner experience and not dictated by it. They can hold the feeling in awareness while operating from something deeper than the feeling. They have what some researchers have called the observer perspective, the ability to watch themselves feeling, to be aware of the emotional weather system they are currently inside, without being identical to that weather system. This is achievable. It is not a genetic trait. It is not a personality type that some people are born with and others simply lack. It is a capacity that is developed through deliberate practice and specific kinds of attention. But before we get into how it is built, we need to understand why most people not only fail to develop it, but actively move in the opposite direction toward greater reactivity, not less. The answer to that question lies in biology, in culture, and in a specific cognitive error that almost everyone makes, and understanding that error is the beginning of building something better. The error is simple. Most people believe that acting on a feeling as quickly as possible is the same as taking the feeling seriously. They believe that the pause, the space between feeling and response, is somehow a dismissal of the feeling, a failure to honor its urgency. They believe that sitting with a feeling rather than immediately expressing it is suppression. And so they express. They react. They confuse speed with authenticity and immediacy with importance. Elite performers have discovered what takes most people decades to learn, if they learn it at all, that the pause is not dismissal. The pause is respect. The pause is the moment in which you actually do something worthy of the feeling, rather than simply venting it into the world and hoping the world rearranges itself in response. The pause is where intention lives. The pause is the difference between the feeling making your decisions and you making your decisions informed by the feeling. And the pause, as it turns out, is trainable, but only if you understand why it keeps collapsing and what it needs to survive under pressure. Chapter 5. The space between stimulus and response. There is a concept that sits at the center of every serious philosophy of human development. Every legitimate framework for emotional intelligence and every tradition of mastery over the self across every culture that has ever grappled seriously with the question of what it means to be a fully developed human being. It has been articulated in different language by Stoic philosophers and Buddhist teachers, by modern psychologists and neuroscientists, by military trainers and performance coaches. The language varies. The insight is the same. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies your power. This idea sounds almost embarrassingly simple when you state it plainly. Of course, there is a space between something happening and your response to it. Everyone knows this. The problem is that for most people, in most situations, that space is so compressed, so nearly instantaneous, that it functions as if it does not exist at all. Something happens. A response happens. The space in between was too small to find, let alone to inhabit. And so the response was not chosen. It was produced automatically, reflexively, by the emotional system doing what emotional systems do when they are left to operate without conscious oversight. The training challenge of genuine emotional discipline is not conceptual. Almost everyone can understand the concept of the space between stimulus and response. The challenge is experiential. The challenge is developing the ability to actually access that space in real time, under real pressure. When the emotional activation is strong and the pull toward immediate reaction feels almost overwhelming. That is the hard part. Not knowing that the space exists, but being able to find it and use it when every instinct in your body is telling you to react right now. To understand why this is so hard, you need to understand something about the architecture of your nervous system. When you encounter a stimulus that registers as threatening, and threat here means anything that the brain interprets as a potential source of pain. Whether that pain is physical, social, emotional, or reputational, the signal goes to the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes threat and initiates the fight-or-flight response before it gets anywhere near the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for deliberate reasoning, weighing options, and making considered choices. This means that in any moment of perceived threat, your body has already begun preparing a response before your thinking brain is even aware that anything has happened. Your heart rate has gone up. Your attention has narrowed. Certain physical systems have activated, and others have suppressed. You are, physiologically, already in motion, already oriented toward either attack or avoidance before the part of you that can actually reason about the situation has had a chance to weigh in. In everyday language, this is what people mean when they say they reacted before they thought. They are describing a process that is literally built into the architecture of the nervous system. It is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is the product of a survival mechanism that evolved over millions of years and was very useful when the threats were primarily physical and the cost of a slow response was dying. The problem is that in modern life, the threats are almost never primarily physical. They are social, professional, relational, reputational, and the cost of a fast response is often much higher than the cost of a slow one. Your nervous system has not caught up with that reality. That is your problem to solve. Solving it requires something that feels counterintuitive to the nervous system's basic programming. It requires, at the moment of highest activation, at the exact moment when the pull toward immediate reaction is strongest, the ability to interrupt that pull, to create, through practice and repetition and deliberate attention, the experience of a pause that your nervous system, left to its own devices, would never generate on its own. This is why the space between stimulus and response is not something you discover. It is something you build. You build it through sustained and specific practice in conditions of gradually increasing difficulty. You build it by deliberately putting yourself in situations where you are emotionally activated and practicing the pause in real time, repeatedly until the pause becomes a trained reflex that competes with the untrained reflex and eventually, through sheer repetition, begins to win. The pause has different forms in different contexts. In a conversation where someone says something that activates you, the pause might be as simple as a breath. A single conscious breath that creates 2 seconds of space where there were previously 0 seconds of space. In those 2 seconds, something remarkable becomes possible. You can notice what you are feeling. You can notice what the feeling seems to want you to do. And you can ask yourself whether what the feeling wants you to do is what you would choose to do if you were operating from your best self rather than from the raw pressure of the feeling itself. 2 seconds does not sound like much. But 2 seconds is the difference between saying the thing that damages a relationship and saying the thing that repairs it. 2 seconds is the difference between the reactive email that escalates a conflict and the considered response that de-escalates it. 2 seconds is the difference between the defensive snap that tells everyone in the room that you cannot handle criticism and the measured acknowledgement that tells them you are someone worth listening to. 2 seconds in the right moment is not a small thing. 2 seconds is everything. The longer the practice, the larger the space grows. People who have trained this for years report that where there was once a hair trigger, a nearly instantaneous collapse from stimulus to reaction, there is now something they can actually navigate. They feel the pull. It is still there. The emotion still arrives with force and with urgency and with all of its original intensity. But there is now a moment, sometimes several moments, between the arrival of the feeling and the production of a response. And in those moments, they are present, they are aware, they are choosing, they are not the emotion. They are the person who is having the emotion. And that difference, small as it might sound, is the entire architecture of genuine self-mastery. The size of that space is also not fixed. It expands under favorable conditions and contracts under pressure. This is why even people who have developed significant capacity in this area find that it fails them in certain situations, usually situations that combine high emotional activation with high stakes and high time pressure. What this means is that developing the space cannot only happen in low stakes, comfortable conditions. It must be trained in conditions that approximate the situations in which you most need it. The pause that is available to you when you are calm and rested is not automatically available to you when you are exhausted and under attack. You have to build it in those conditions specifically. This is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of emotional mastery. It is not enough to understand the concept. It is not enough to practice the pause in situations where the pause is easy. You have to do the uncomfortable and deliberately provocative work of exposing yourself to genuine emotional activation and practicing the discipline there, in that difficulty, until the pause becomes accessible not just in easy moments but in the ones that count. The moments when someone questions your competence in a room full of people whose opinion matters to you. The moments when you receive news that threatens something you have built. The moments when the person you care most about says the thing that cuts deepest. The moments when every nerve in your body is screaming react and the only thing that stands between you and a response you will regret is this practice, this specific, trained, deliberately cultivated ability to find the space and use it. You cannot think your way into having this capacity. You can only practice your way into it. And the practice begins not with technique, but with understanding. Specifically, understanding why the untrained nervous system defaults to reactivity in the first place, and why that default is not a moral failing but a mechanical one. A mechanical problem has a mechanical solution, and the solution, once you understand the problem fully, becomes not just possible but inevitable. The architecture of your reaction is not something that was done to you. It is something that was built by you over years in response to the environment and experiences that shaped you, which means it can be rebuilt, which means the space can be expanded, which means the person you are in your most reactive moments is not the final version of who you are. It is the current version, and the current version can be trained. Chapter 6. Why most people react before they think. Most people, if you ask them directly, would tell you they want to be the kind of person who responds rather than reacts. They have heard the distinction. They understand it, at least in the abstract. They know that the person who flies off the handle in a difficult conversation is not the person they admire or aspire to be. They know that the email fired off in anger is almost never the right email. They know that the decision made at the height of emotional activation is rarely the decision that looks wise in the rearview mirror. They know all of this, and then they react anyway. The question worth sitting with is not why people fail to live their values in general. Human beings fail to live their values in all kinds of contexts and for all kinds of reasons, and most of those failures are understandable. The question worth sitting with is this specific one. Why, in the exact moments when the emotional pull toward reactivity is strongest, does knowing better so reliably fail to produce doing better? The answer has several layers, and understanding all of them matters because each layer requires a different kind of work to address. The first layer is neurological, and we have already touched on it. The amygdala moves faster than the prefrontal cortex. The threat response system initiates before the reasoning system has a chance to weigh in. This is simply the architecture of the human brain, and no amount of intellectual understanding of the situation changes the basic timing. Knowing that you should not react does not slow down the amygdala. Only specific, repeated training changes the relationship between those two systems, and that training must happen at the level of the body and the nervous system, not at the level of intellectual conviction. But the neurological layer, while important, is not the whole story, because plenty of people who understand the neuroscience, who know exactly what the amygdala does and why, still react in the moments that count. Understanding the mechanism is a beginning. It is not a solution. The solution requires going deeper into the other layers. The second layer is habitual. Reactivity, like most patterns of behavior, is a habit, and habits are not undone by deciding not to do them. They are undone by replacing them with competing habits that are practiced until they become the dominant reflex in the situations where the old habit used to operate. Most people's default response to emotional activation has been in place for decades. It was established in childhood, reinforced through adolescence, and practiced thousands of times into adulthood. The neural pathway that leads from threat perception to reactive behavior is deeply grooved. It is fast, it is familiar, and it requires no effort to access. The alternative pathway, the one that leads through awareness and choice, is narrow, unfamiliar, and requires effort at precisely the moment when effort is hardest to generate. Of course, the old pathway wins most of the time. Of course, people react before they think. The question is not why the habit is strong. The question is what it actually takes to establish the competing habit with enough consistency to begin to shift the balance. The third layer is identity, and this is the layer that most people do not examine honestly enough. For many people, their reactivity is not just a habit, it is a self-concept. They think of themselves as passionate, as someone who speaks their mind, as someone who does not suffer fools, as someone whose emotions are real and authentic and should not be managed or constrained. These self-concepts are not entirely without value. Passion, directness, and authenticity are genuinely good qualities. The problem is when they become the story that justifies reactivity. When "I am just being real" becomes the narrative that excuses the behavior that is damaging your relationships, undermining your effectiveness, and keeping you from becoming who you are capable of being. This layer is the hardest to work with, because it requires a certain willingness to look honestly at a story you have been telling yourself about who you are, and ask whether that story is serving you or whether it is protecting a pattern of behavior that would not survive honest scrutiny. Most people would rather hold on to the story than question it. This is human. It is also very expensive. The cost of maintaining the identity that excuses reactivity is paid in every relationship that is strained by it, every opportunity that is missed because of it, every version of yourself that never got to emerge because the habitual pattern kept crowding it out. The fourth layer is environmental. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to context, and the environments most people spend their lives in are not designed to support non-reactive responses. They are designed to reward speed. Social media rewards the immediate, heated take. Workplace cultures often reward the person who responds first and most forcefully rather than the person who waits and thinks. Families, having practiced their reactive patterns with each other for decades, have established dynamics that practically pull reactive responses out of each member on cue. The environment is not neutral. It is actively pulling in the direction of reactivity. And resisting that pull requires more than good intentions. It requires understanding what the environment is doing and making deliberate choices about how to engage with it differently. The fifth and final layer is perhaps the most uncomfortable to name. For a significant number of people, reactivity is not just a habit or an identity or an environmental response. It is a form of control. The reactive outburst, the volatile emotional response, the unpredictability that keeps others walking on eggshells. These are, in certain relationship dynamics, a form of power. The person whose anger others fear has, through that fear, established a kind of dominance. The person whose emotional volatility causes others to manage their behavior around it has, through that volatility, shaped their environment. This is not a healthy or admirable form of power, but it is real power. And people who have built their sense of control and influence on it will not give it up easily, because the thing they would need to replace it with genuine authority, earned trust, the kind of influence that does not depend on others being afraid of your next reaction, requires far more sustained work than the reactive pattern does. Understanding why most people react before they think is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is a diagnostic exercise, and accurate diagnosis is where every real change begins. When you know what is actually driving the pattern, you know what actually needs to change. And what needs to change almost always is not one thing but several things working together. The nervous system, the habit, the identity, the environment, and occasionally the willingness to give up a form of control that feels less like power every time you look at it honestly. Chapter 7. The nervous system is the battlefield. Everything you are trying to build in the domain of emotional discipline lives in your body before it lives anywhere else. This is not a metaphor. It is not a philosophical position. It is the literal physiological reality of how change of this kind actually happens. You cannot think your way into a calmer nervous system. You cannot decide your way into a slower amygdala response. You cannot intellectualize your way into a body that does not flood with cortisol when it perceives threat. The work that changes how you respond under pressure is body work. And if you skip the body work, you will find that everything you build on top of it collapses the moment real pressure is applied. The nervous system has two primary operating modes that are relevant here. The first is the sympathetic mode, which is the activation state, the fight-or-flight state. The state in which the body is mobilizing resources for immediate action in response to perceived threat. Heart rate up, breathing fast and shallow, digestion suppressed, attention narrowed to the threat, cognitive resources redirected away from complex reasoning and toward fast pattern recognition and rapid motor response. This is the state the body enters when something activates you emotionally, and it is designed to make you fast, not thoughtful. The second is the parasympathetic mode, which is the rest and digest state. The state in which the body is settled, resources are being replenished, complex cognitive functions are fully available, and the kind of broad, flexible, creative thinking that good decision-making requires is possible. This is the state in which you are most capable of, the pause most capable of inhabiting the space between stimulus and response and using it well. The problem is that it is also the state that the first difficult stimulus of the day can knock you out of in an instant if your nervous system is not trained. Most people's nervous systems are chronically tilted towards sympathetic activation, even in the absence of acute threat. Chronic stress, poor sleep, inflammatory diet, sedentary lifestyle, constant low-grade stimulation from screens and devices, the background anxiety of modern life, all of these push the nervous system toward a state of readiness that was designed for occasional, acute threats, but is now being maintained as a kind of permanent baseline. And a nervous system that is already running at a high level of activation does not have much distance to travel to reach the threshold at which reactive behavior becomes automatic. Small provocations produce large responses. Normal friction feels like attack. Manageable difficulty feels like crisis. This is why the first and most fundamental work of building genuine emotional discipline is not cognitive at all. It is physiological. It is the work of training the nervous system toward a more settled baseline, expanding what the research calls the window of tolerance, the range of emotional activation within which you can still access higher cognitive functions, still make deliberate choices, still find and use the space between stimulus and response. That work takes several specific forms. The first is breath work. Controlled breathing is one of the most powerful and direct levers available for shifting the nervous system between sympathetic and parasympathetic states. And unlike almost every other intervention that affects the autonomic nervous system, breathing is something you can do consciously and deliberately. A slow exhalation longer than the inhalation activates the vagus nerve and directly engages the parasympathetic system. This is not a relaxation technique in the soft, lifestyle supplement sense of the phrase. It is a physiological interrupt. It is literally reaching into your autonomic nervous system through one of the few channels that allows conscious access, and using that access to change your state. Practiced daily, not in moments of crisis, but as a consistent discipline that builds a different baseline. Deliberate breathing practice changes the resting tone of the nervous system over time. The person who breathes deliberately for 10 to 20 minutes every day is not the same person who never does. Their heart rate variability, which is one of the most reliable measures of autonomic nervous system health and resilience, is different. Their recovery time after activation, the time it takes for the system to return to baseline after a difficult stimulus, is shorter. Their threshold for moving into reactive behavior is higher. These are measurable, physiological changes, not metaphors, not subjective impressions, actual changes in how the body works. The second form of this work is physical training under conditions of controlled stress. Hard physical exercise is one of the most effective tools for training the nervous system's relationship with activation. When you push your body hard in training, when you go into genuine physical discomfort, when your heart rate is high and your lungs are burning and the pull to stop is real and strong, you are practicing, in a physical domain, the exact same skill that emotional discipline requires in the cognitive domain. You are practicing staying present in a state of high activation. You are practicing not collapsing into avoidance when the discomfort is real. You are practicing the pause, the choice to keep going, not because the discomfort has stopped, but because you have decided that the goal matters more than the discomfort does. This transfer is real. People who train their physical tolerance for discomfort consistently report greater emotional resilience in non-physical domains, not because the physical and emotional systems are the same, but because they are governed by overlapping regulatory mechanisms, and because the practice of maintaining composure and continuing to function at high levels while the body is under genuine stress trains something that the nervous system then makes available in other high activation contexts. The third form is sleep. This sounds ordinary. It is not. Sleep deprivation is one of the most reliable ways to compress the window of tolerance and increase reactive behavior, and the degree to which most people underestimate its impact on their emotional functioning is staggering. A person operating on insufficient sleep is not just tired. They are, measurably and significantly, more reactive. Their amygdala response to negative stimuli is stronger. Their prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate that amygdala response is weaker. The very architecture of the brain that governs the space between stimulus and response is degraded by sleep deprivation in ways that cannot be compensated for through effort or intention. You cannot willpower your way to emotional discipline when you are chronically sleep-deprived. The hardware is impaired. The fourth form is what might be called progressive exposure, the deliberate practice of entering activating situations and training the pause there in the difficulty, rather than only in comfortable or controlled environments. This looks different for different people. For some, it means structured training, martial arts, competitive sports, high-stakes presentations, difficult conversations deliberately initiated. For others, it means any consistent practice that involves genuine emotional activation and a commitment to meeting that activation with awareness and choice rather than automatic reaction. The specifics matter less than the principle. The nervous system must be trained in the conditions it will face, not only in the conditions where training is easiest. All of this work, the breath work, the physical training, the sleep, the progressive exposure, is not separate from the project of emotional mastery. It is the foundation of it. You cannot build the kind of response you want in difficult moments if the ground the building sits on is unstable. The nervous system is the battlefield, and winning the battle is not a matter of willpower or intellectual understanding. It is a matter of taking the physiological work seriously enough to do it consistently, not when you feel like it, not when it is convenient, but as a non-negotiable discipline that serves everything else you are trying to build. Chapter 8. Training the pause. There are people in your life, you can probably identify them without too much effort, who seem to operate with a kind of internal deliberateness that most people simply do not possess. When something difficult happens, there is a beat before they respond. When they are challenged or criticized or provoked, there is a moment of something, not blankness, not absence, but presence before they engage. When the pressure in a room rises, they seem to slow down rather than speed up. And the responses they produce from that beat, that moment, that pause, tend to be more accurate, more appropriate, and more effective than what most people produce from the reflex that fires in the absence of it. You probably assumed that these people were just built that way, that the pause was native to their temperament, a gift of biology rather than a product of practice. In the overwhelming majority of cases, that assumption is wrong. The pause is trainable. It is not a personality trait. It is a skill, a specific, learnable, practicable skill, and the people who seem to possess it naturally are almost always people who have, through some combination of deliberate practice and formative experience, built it the same way every skill is built, through repetition in conditions of progressive difficulty until the new pattern displaces the old one as the dominant response. Training the pause begins with something that is easy to underestimate and easy to dismiss, precisely because it sounds so simple. It begins with noticing, not changing, not intervening, not producing a different response, just noticing what is actually happening inside you in real time, in the moments of emotional activation, before you do anything else. Most people have a surprisingly poor relationship with their own emotional experience. Not because they do not feel things deeply, they often do, but because the transit time between feeling and reaction is so short that the feeling never gets examined. It arrives and it acts. It shows up and it speaks. The person is the feeling's vehicle rather than its observer. And you cannot train the pause until you can first notice that the feeling has arrived, actually notice it, in real time, with some degree of separation between the noticing self and the feeling being noticed. This is where any honest contemplative tradition, any serious mindfulness practice, and any rigorous psychological work around emotional regulation converge. The first move is always the same: awareness before action, not suppression, not analysis, not judgment about whether the feeling is appropriate or valid or rational. Just the simple, practiced, repeated act of noticing. There is anger here. There is fear here. There is hurt here. Naming what is happening, even silently and internally, begins to create the separation that the pause requires. It is a tiny separation at first, a hairline gap between the feeling and the identification with it. But it is a beginning, and beginnings, practiced daily, compound into something significant. From noticing, the next stage of training is learning to deliberately create a physical pause before responding in activating situations. This is mechanical before it is anything else. You are not yet trying to produce the perfect response. You are not trying to achieve some elevated state of equanimity. You are simply practicing the insertion of a gap, any gap, however small, between the stimulus and the response. A breath, a count to 3, a deliberate physical shift, sitting back slightly, uncrossing your arms, feeling your feet on the floor. These are not tricks. They are physical interrupts that create the moment of awareness that the untrained system never generates on its own. The breath deserves particular attention because it is the most portable and the most powerful of these tools. A single deliberate breath in through the nose for 4 counts, out through the mouth for 6, takes less than 10 seconds and creates a physiological shift that makes the pause not just possible but easier. It does this through the mechanism we have already discussed. The extended exhalation activates the parasympathetic nervous system directly, which reduces the intensity of the activation enough to give the prefrontal cortex a chance to come back online. You are not eliminating the feeling with this breath. You are creating a 10-second window in which something other than pure reflex can operate. 10 seconds is enough. 10 seconds used with intention is more than most reactive moments require. The third stage of training is what might be called the interrogation of the feeling. Once the pause is in place, once you have created the gap and breathed into it, the practice is to ask the feeling what it is telling you and what it wants from you. These are 2 different questions, and they are both important. What the feeling is telling you is information about your inner state. I felt disrespected. I felt threatened. I felt overlooked. I felt the weight of something that matters to me. This information is valuable. This is the feeling doing what feelings are designed to do, notifying you of something significant in your experience. Honor it. Acknowledge it. Take the information seriously. But what the feeling wants from you is a different question entirely. And this is where the training diverges from what most people do. Most people conflate the feeling's arrival with a mandate to act on it. The feeling says, do something about this, and they do something about this immediately. From the feeling, guided by the feeling's urgency rather than by their considered judgment. What the practice requires is separating the information the feeling carries from the action the feeling seems to demand. You can receive the information without acting on the demand. You can know that you are angry without letting the anger speak. You can know that you are afraid without letting the fear decide. You can hold the feeling as data while choosing your response from something deeper than the data itself. This is the core of the pause as a practice, not suppression, not performance, not the pretense that you are feeling something other than what you are actually feeling, but the honest, present moment acknowledgement of what is happening inside, combined with the deliberate choice to respond from your values and your judgment rather than from the raw emotional pressure. Values and judgment are slower than emotion. They require the pause to be accessible at all, which is why the pause is not a luxury. It is the precondition for acting from the best of who you are rather than the most reactive part of who you are. The fourth stage of training, the one that separates the people who develop this capacity in sustainable, durable ways from the people who develop it partially and then lose it under sufficient pressure, is practice under increasing difficulty. The pause you can access when someone mildly irritates you in a low-stakes situation is not the same pause you can access when someone publicly humiliates you in a situation where something significant is on the line. Both require training, but they require different levels of it. The only way to build the pause that is available under extreme pressure is to deliberately train in conditions of extreme pressure, which means seeking out the difficult conversations rather than avoiding them, taking on the high-stakes situations rather than routing around them, putting yourself deliberately and repeatedly in the situations where your reactivity is most likely to be triggered and practicing the pause there in that difficulty, not because it is comfortable, but because comfort is not where durable capacity is built. What this training produces, over time, is something that initially feels effortful and then gradually begins to feel more natural, though it never stops requiring attention entirely. The pause begins to feel less like an interruption of your natural response and more like an expression of who you actually are. Your identity shifts slowly and then more rapidly, from someone who reacts to someone who responds. And that identity shift is not superficial. It changes what you do in moments of pressure because it changes who you understand yourself to be in those moments. You are no longer the person at the mercy of the feeling. You are the person who feels it fully and then makes a choice. That is not a small shift. It is a fundamental reorientation of your relationship with your own inner life, and it is available to anyone willing to do the work that produces it. Chapter 9. Emotional depth as a competitive advantage. At this point in the conversation, something important needs to be named directly, because the project of training the pause, of building the space between stimulus and response, of developing the capacity to feel without reacting, all of this could easily be mistaken for a project of emotional reduction, a project of becoming less feeling, less alive, less connected to the interior richness that makes life meaningful. That is not what this is. And the distinction matters enormously. The most disciplined people in the world are not less emotional than average people. They are more emotional in the right way, and that emotional depth, far from being a liability they have learned to manage, is one of the most significant competitive advantages they possess. This is a truth that the conventional framing of emotional control almost entirely misses, and it is worth dwelling on because understanding it changes the entire orientation of the project, from something that sounds like loss into something that reveals itself as gain. Emotional depth, the capacity to feel things fully, vividly, and with a kind of richness of inner experience that most people either have not developed or have learned to suppress, is a source of several distinct advantages that show up in competitive, professional, and relational domains in ways that are measurable and significant. The first advantage is perception. People who allow themselves to feel their emotional responses fully, without immediately suppressing or overriding them, develop a sensitivity to the emotional landscape of any environment they enter. They notice what other people are feeling, not in a vague, imprecise way, but in a specific, calibrated way that gives them access to information about what is actually happening in a room that less emotionally attuned people simply do not have. They read the tension under a polished presentation. They notice the insecurity beneath a confident assertion. They feel the shift in energy when something unsaid is influencing the conversation more than anything being said aloud. This perceptual advantage is available only to people who have kept their own emotional sensitivity intact, who have not deadened it through suppression or bypassed it through performance. The second advantage is connection. Human beings form trust with each other through emotional resonance, not through logical agreement, not through shared objectives, through the felt sense that the person across from them actually understands something about their experience. The person who has maintained genuine emotional depth, who feels things fully and is capable of genuine empathy rather than its simulation, creates real connection with others in ways that the emotionally flat person simply cannot replicate. And connection, in almost every domain that involves other human beings, is the currency through which influence, trust, and collaboration are built. The leader who people follow into difficulty is not the one who seems most detached from what the difficulty costs. It is the one who clearly understands what the difficulty costs, who has felt it themselves, in something approximating the way the people they are leading are feeling it, and who has decided to go forward anyway. The third advantage is creativity. Emotional depth is one of the most significant inputs into creative and generative thinking of every kind. The capacity to feel the full range of human experience, to be genuinely moved by things, to have a rich interior life that is genuinely engaged with the world. This is the substrate from which original thought emerges. The most innovative thinkers, the most compelling artists, the most transformative leaders in every domain are almost universally people of unusual emotional depth. They feel the problem more intensely than others. They care about the solution more urgently. They are moved by what is wrong in a way that generates the motivation and the creativity to build something better. Reduce the emotional depth and you reduce the creative capacity. The two are not separate. The fourth advantage is resilience. This one surprises people, but genuine emotional depth, the capacity to feel difficult things fully rather than to suppress or bypass them, is actually a source of resilience rather than a liability to it. The reason is straightforward. Emotions that are felt fully tend to resolve. They have a natural arc. They arrive, they peak, they subside. Emotions that are suppressed or denied do not resolve, they accumulate. They go underground. They build pressure in the system until the pressure demands release, at which point the release is rarely clean, rarely appropriate to the situation, and rarely under the person's control. The person who feels their grief fully is, paradoxically, more resilient than the person who suppresses it, because the person who feels it processes it and moves through it, while the person who suppresses it carries it forward into every subsequent situation as unprocessed weight. This is why the emotional depth that comes with genuine feeling is not something to be eliminated or even significantly reduced in the pursuit of discipline. It is something to be preserved, cultivated, and put to work. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel fully and to maintain the capacity to choose your response anyway. To bring all of your emotional intelligence and sensitivity to bear on the situations you encounter, while refusing to let the raw pressure of any particular feeling substitute for the deliberate judgment your values and your wisdom can produce when given the space to operate. The people who have mastered this live differently. They are not the people at the party who stand in the corner, controlled and distant, untouched by everything around them. They are often the most present people in the room, the most genuinely engaged, the most genuinely moved, the most genuinely interested in what is happening and what the people around them are experiencing. Their discipline shows up not in their absence from the emotional life of the room, but in the quality of what they contribute to it. They bring warmth and genuine feeling without the volatility that makes people wary. They bring honesty and directness without the aggression that makes people defensive. They bring the full weight of their care and their investment without the neediness or the reactivity that makes care feel like a burden rather than a gift. This is the model worth aiming for. Not the cold, detached, emotionless ideal that the myth of the disciplined person usually presents, but something richer, more complex, and ultimately more powerful. The person who brings all of themselves to their life, all of their feeling, all of their depth, all of their genuine human responsiveness, and who has developed enough internal architecture to ensure that what comes out of all of that feeling is deliberate, chosen, and worthy of the person they have committed to becoming. Chapter 10. The Art of Reading a Room Without Being Moved by It. There is a specific skill that the most socially and professionally effective people possess that is almost never discussed in any serious way, and that is almost impossible to develop without first building the internal architecture we have been describing throughout this script. It is the skill of reading a room accurately, in real time, with genuine depth of perception, while remaining internally stable enough to respond to what you perceive with intention rather than being swept up in the emotional currents you have detected. Reading a room, in the shallow sense that most people use the phrase, means simply noticing what kind of energy a situation has and calibrating your behavior accordingly. Don't make this joke here. Don't bring up that topic now. This is not the moment for that kind of directness. This level of social awareness is useful, and more people would benefit from developing it. But it is not what we are talking about here. Reading a room at the deeper level we are discussing means something considerably more demanding. It means being genuinely sensitive to the emotional undercurrents of a situation, the things people are feeling but not saying, the tensions that are shaping the conversation without being named, the power dynamics that are operating beneath the surface of apparently neutral exchanges, the fear or ambition or insecurity or hope that is coloring how each person in the room is processing what is being said. It means feeling into the room rather than just observing it from a cognitive distance. And here is the challenge. The more accurately you read a room at this level, the more you are going to feel what you perceive. Real emotional attunement is not a detached, observational skill. It is an empathetic one. You pick up what is in the room by resonating with it, by allowing something in you to respond to what is happening in other people. Which means that if you have shut down your own emotional responsiveness in pursuit of the emotionless ideal we have already dismantled, you have also shut down one of your most important sources of real-time information about what is happening in the social and professional environments you inhabit. The skill being described here, reading a room without being moved by it, is therefore not a skill of emotional detachment. It is a skill of emotional management. You need to be responsive enough to pick up what is happening, and disciplined enough not to be destabilized by what you pick up. You need to feel the tension in the room without becoming tense. You need to sense the fear without becoming afraid. You need to detect the aggression without becoming defensive. And you need to do all of this in real time, while also engaging with the explicit content of whatever is happening, while also managing your own inner state, while also deciding what, if anything, to do with what you are perceiving. This is a high-order skill. It develops slowly, and it requires the foundation of everything that has come before it. Without the physiologically settled nervous system, without the baseline calm that makes perception possible rather than overwhelming the emotional inputs from the room, will simply amplify your own activation rather than inform it. Without the trained pause, without the practiced capacity to hold what you are feeling without immediately acting on it, whatever you read in the room will flow through you directly into your behavior rather than passing through the filter of your judgment and intention. The first component of developing this skill is learning to make a distinction that most people never make explicitly. The distinction between what you perceive and what you absorb. Perception means taking in the emotional information of a situation clearly and accurately. Absorption means allowing that information to become part of your inner state, to actually feel what you are detecting, to the point where your own composure is affected by the emotional weather you are reading. Perception is the goal. Absorption is the problem. And the difference between them is, again, the space. The moment of awareness in which you can note what you are picking up from the environment without immediately importing it into your own internal experience. You can observe that the room is anxious without becoming anxious yourself. You can notice that the dominant figure in the conversation is angry without allowing their anger to trigger your own defensive response. You can feel the sadness or the desperation in someone's communication without letting that feeling overwhelm your ability to respond to them in a way that is actually useful. This distinction, perceiving without absorbing, is also the distinction between empathy and what some researchers call emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is what happens when you simply catch the emotional state of the people around you the way you might catch a cold automatically, without awareness, without choice. This is the default mode for most people. They walk into a tense room and become tense. They sit with a depressed person and feel their own mood darken. They encounter someone's panic and find themselves beginning to feel the edges of panic themselves. None of this is chosen. It simply happens as a result of the mirror neuron system doing what it is designed to do, modeling the internal states of others in your own nervous system as a means of understanding what they are experiencing. Empathy is something different. Empathy is the deliberate, chosen act of allowing yourself to understand what another person is experiencing without losing yourself in that understanding. It is a form of presence that maintains a self, that maintains the observer who is doing the understanding, even in the act of moving toward another person's experience. It requires exactly what everything else we have been discussing requires: the pause, the awareness, the separation between noticing and being consumed by what is noticed. The person who has developed the full capacity we are describing, emotionally sensitive enough to read a room with genuine accuracy, internally disciplined enough not to be destabilized by what they read, has access to a form of social intelligence that is among the rarest and most powerful human capabilities. They know what is actually happening in the interactions they are part of. They know what people are actually feeling beneath what they are saying. They know where the real leverage points are, where the unaddressed tensions live, where the opportunity to shift the dynamic exists. And because they are not being swept along by the emotional currents they are perceiving, they can choose deliberately how or whether to engage with what they know. That deliberateness, in the domain of human interaction, is not just a personal advantage. It is a form of genuine leadership. It is the capacity to be the most present, most aware, most intentional person in the room. And it begins, always, with the same foundation: feel everything, absorb nothing, respond with intention to what you have learned. Chapter 11. Pressure, provocation, and the test of real discipline. Everything we have discussed up to this point has been preparation. The nervous system work, the training of the pause, the development of emotional depth and social intelligence, the construction of the internal architecture that makes genuine self-mastery possible. All of it has been preparation for what actually tests it. And what actually tests it is not a comfortable practice session or a low-stakes social interaction or a reflective morning with a journal. What actually tests everything you have built is pressure. Real pressure. The kind that arrives uninvited, at the worst possible moment, in the form you were least expecting, and asks you to be the person you have been training to become when being that person is the hardest thing you have ever been asked to do. Pressure and provocation are the crucibles of discipline, not because they are punishments or obstacles to be endured, but because they are the conditions in which the gap between who you are and who you are capable of becoming becomes most visible. In comfort, everyone is disciplined. In ease, everyone can be patient. In the absence of any real threat or challenge, the reactive pattern lies quiet, and you can mistake the quiet for mastery. It is only when something arrives that genuinely activates you, that threatens something you care about, that challenges your sense of yourself, that provokes the oldest and most deeply grooved of your reactive patterns, that you find out what you have actually built and what is still just intention. The first thing to understand about pressure is that it reveals rather than creates. When you lose your composure under pressure, the pressure did not put a character flaw in you that wasn't there before. It revealed a pattern that was already operating quietly beneath the surface of your everyday behavior. The person who becomes aggressive when their authority is questioned was already carrying that pattern. The person who collapses into defensiveness when criticized already had that vulnerability in place. The person who becomes cold and withdrawn under emotional threat was already organized around protection in a way that the easy circumstances of everyday life did not make visible. Pressure is a diagnostic tool. It shows you exactly where the work still needs to be done. This reframe matters enormously because most people experience their reactive behavior under pressure as shameful as evidence that they are fundamentally flawed, that their efforts to become more disciplined are failing, that they simply are not the kind of person who can hold composure when things get genuinely hard. This interpretation is not only inaccurate, it is actively counterproductive because it converts the most valuable information you have about where your development needs to go into a source of self-attack that makes the development less likely, not more. The person who loses their composure under pressure and then spends 3 days in self-recrimination has learned nothing useful from the experience. The person who loses their composure notices it as clearly as possible in real time, recovers as quickly and cleanly as they can, and then reflects on what specifically activated them and why that person has used the pressure exactly as it is most useful to be used. Provocation is a particular form of pressure that deserves its own discussion, because it is the form that people are most likely to mishandle and the form that the untrained reactive pattern is most spectacularly vulnerable to. Provocation is pressure that is directed at you, intentionally designed to activate your reactive pattern, to destabilize your composure, to get you to produce a response that serves the provoker's interests more than your own. It is, in its most deliberate forms, a manipulation. And the most important thing to understand about deliberate provocation is that responding reactively to it is precisely the outcome the provoker is engineering. Your reaction is their victory. Your composure is your own. This is not a small insight. Think about all of the situations in your life where someone has said or done something that activated you, and where your reactive response, the anger, the defensiveness, the cutting remark, the withdrawal made the situation significantly worse than it needed to be. In many of those situations, The other person was not accidentally touching a nerve. They were touching the nerve deliberately, because they understood that touching the nerve would produce a response that served them. The critical colleague who frames their criticism in a way they know will trigger your defensiveness. The adversary who raises the topic they know will cloud your judgment. The family member who says the specific thing that they know from decades of experience will make you irrational. The competitor who provokes you publicly in a context where losing your composure will damage your reputation more than any fair criticism of your work could. In all of these cases, the reactive response is the trap. And the only way to avoid the trap is not to not feel the provocation. You will feel it, fully and completely, because the person doing it knows exactly where to aim, but to feel it without letting what you feel determine what you do. The pause is never more important and never harder to find than in the moment of deliberate provocation, because in that moment, every nerve in your body is telling you that something demands a response, that to not react is weakness, that your silence or your composure is a concession or a defeat. None of those stories are true, but they feel true with an urgency that is genuinely difficult to resist. The training for provocation is the same training we have already described, applied with particular focus to the situations and the types of activation that your specific reactive pattern most reliably produces. You need to know your triggers, not in a vague, general way, not just I get reactive when I feel criticized, but specifically, what kind of criticism, from what kind of person, in what kind of context, under what specific conditions does the criticism that activates you most strongly land? The more precisely you can map the terrain of your own reactivity, the more specifically you can train against it, and the more likely you are to be able to find the pause at the exact moment when the exact provocation you are most vulnerable to makes its appearance. There is also a broader reframe of provocation that becomes available once you have developed sufficient stability to hold it. Provocation, particularly the deliberate kind, tells you something important about the person doing the provoking. People who routinely use provocation as a tool in their interactions with others are almost always people who lack access to more effective means of influence. They provoke because provoking is what works, because the people around them reliably react in ways that give provocation its power. The moment you stop reacting is the moment provocation becomes useless as a tool, and the person who discovers that their provocation no longer produces the desired effect is, almost universally, a person who is forced to find a more honest and direct way of engaging with you. Your composure does not just protect you from the manipulation. It dismantles the mechanism that makes the manipulation possible. It changes the dynamic at a fundamental level, and it does so entirely through internal work, through the quality of your own response, without requiring you to say a single word about what you have noticed or what you are doing. This is one of the most quietly powerful aspects of genuine emotional discipline. It does not require announcement. It does not need to be performed or explained or made visible. It simply operates. The person who has built the space between stimulus and response does not need to tell the room they have built it. The room discovers it the first time a provocation lands and finds no purchase. The room discovers it the first time a pressure that would have collapsed a less developed person produces nothing more than a steady, measured, deliberate engagement. And the room adjusts accordingly because the social and professional environment is always, at a fundamental level, calibrating its treatment of you against what it has learned You will tolerate, and how it has learned. You respond. Chapter 12. When silence is the most powerful response. There is a profound misunderstanding at the center of most people's relationship with silence in difficult situations. The misunderstanding is this: that silence is the absence of a response, that to say nothing is to do nothing, that in a moment of conflict, challenge, criticism, or provocation, the choice to not speak is a passive choice, a retreat, a concession, a failure of courage or of engagement. This misunderstanding is so embedded in the default thinking of most people that they will fill silence with words they do not mean, positions they have not fully thought through, emotional reactions they have not had the space to process, and responses they will spend considerable time wishing they could take back, all in the service of not appearing to have nothing to say, all in the service of the deeply conditioned belief that the person who speaks first, who fills the space, who demonstrates through immediate verbal production that they are present and engaged, and unafraid, that this person is the stronger one. The reality, which takes some years and some painful experience to learn fully, is almost the opposite. In a wide range of high-stakes interpersonal and professional situations, the person who can remain silent genuinely, comfortably, undefensively silent, not the tense, pressurized silence of someone who is fighting the urge to speak, but the settled, aware, intentional silence of someone who has decided that silence is the right response, is almost always the most powerful person in the room. This is not a social manipulation technique. It is not advice to use silence as a weapon or to perform composure in a calculated way. It is something more fundamental. An observation about what silence actually communicates when it comes from the right, internal place. Silence that comes from emotional mastery, from genuine comfort with not filling every space with verbal output, communicates several things simultaneously. It communicates self-possession. It communicates that the speaker does not control you by virtue of having spoken. It communicates that you are someone who thinks before responding, rather than responding in order to think. It communicates that whatever is happening does not require your immediate, defensive, nervous engagement in order to be handled. All of this lands in the room before you have said a single word. Think about the moments in your own experience when someone responded to a difficult statement, a criticism, a challenge, a provocation, not with an immediate counter, but with silence, real silence, held comfortably, without visible tension, for several beats longer than felt normal. Think about what that silence did to the dynamic. In most cases, the silence shifted the weight of the room. The person who had spoken into that silence suddenly felt the pressure of what they had said more acutely. The statement that had seemed powerful when it left their mouth began to hang in the air in a way that exposed its vulnerabilities. The silence became, without any words being deployed on your behalf, a form of response arguably more effective than anything you could have said in the immediate heat of the moment. The reason silence is so powerful as a response to provocation or challenge is precisely because it denies the reactive mechanism its fuel. Reactive communication is a loop. It generates an output designed to produce an emotional response, and then it feeds on that response, escalating the dynamic in the direction the provoker needs it to go. Silence breaks the loop at the level of input. The output is generated, it lands, and then nothing. No escalation, no defensiveness, no signal that the output reached its target. The loop has nowhere to go, and the person who sent the output is left to sit with it, which is frequently a far more uncomfortable experience than they anticipated. Silence is also the space in which the most intelligent responses are formed. The response that is produced in the silence, after the pause, after the breath, after the careful consideration of what is actually happening and what response would actually serve you best, is almost always more accurate, more effective, and more aligned with your actual values and objectives than the response that would have been produced in the reactive moment. The silence is not empty. It is full of processing, full of judgment, full of the kind of thinking that is impossible when the nervous system is running hot and the reflex is pulling toward immediate output. Learning to be comfortable with silence in activating situations is itself a practice. Most people's discomfort with silence is physiological before it is anything else. The nervous system experiences the pressure to fill silence as real, physical pressure, and the relief that comes from speaking feels like genuine relief. This is a conditioned response. And, like all conditioned responses, it can be reconditioned through deliberate exposure to the discomfort, combined with the repeated experience that the discomfort passes and that what follows the silence is better than what would have followed the speech. This takes practice. It takes the willingness to be uncomfortable in the silence rather than fleeing the discomfort by speaking. But every time you hold the silence past the point where the urge to speak becomes strong, and discover that nothing catastrophic happens, and that the silence served you better than the words would have, you recalibrate the reflex slightly in the direction of comfort with quiet. There are situations, of course, where silence is not the right response, where speaking is clearly called for, where the issue requires direct engagement, where staying silent would itself be a form of avoidance rather than a form of mastery. The point is not that you should always be silent in difficult situations. The point is that silence should be a genuine option, freely available to you, chosen when it serves you rather than avoided, because the discomfort of it feels unmanageable. The person who can speak or be silent with equal ease, choosing between the two not from reflex or from discomfort, but from deliberate assessment of what the situation actually requires, that person has access to a range of response that is simply unavailable to the person for whom speech is compulsive. The most powerful communicators in any domain are almost universally people who are deeply comfortable with silence. Not because they have nothing to say, because they have understood something that most people spend their lives missing, that what you choose not to say is as much a part of your communication as what you do say, that the space around your words shapes the meaning of your words, that the composure you bring to a moment of pressure speaks at a volume that no amount of reactive speech could achieve, and that the person who waits, who thinks, who sits in the discomfort of the pause, who lets the silence do its work and then speaks from that place of clarity and intention, is always going to communicate something more powerful than the person who filled the silence first. Chapter 13. How to feel fully without being controlled. We have arrived at what is, in many ways, the most important chapter in this script, because everything that has come before it has been building toward this single specific capacity. The ability to feel the full range and depth of your emotional experience without suppression, without denial, without performance, while simultaneously maintaining enough internal freedom that no particular feeling gets to make your decisions for you. This is the integration. This is where feeling everything and reacting to nothing stop being two separate disciplines and become one unified way of being. Most people live at one of two extremes on the spectrum between feeling and control. On one end are the people who feel everything and are controlled by what they feel. Every emotion has authority. Every feeling generates action. The anger speaks. The fear retreats. The hurt punishes. The jealousy manipulates. The longing makes promises the rest of the person cannot keep. This is a life lived in reaction not just to external circumstances, but to the constant, shifting pressure of an inner emotional life that has never been given any structure or any relationship to something deeper than itself. On the other end are the people who have achieved a kind of control through disconnection. They are not moved by things, or not visibly moved, but only because they have built such thorough defenses against their own emotional experience that the feelings arrive and find no purchase, no acknowledgement, no space to exist. These people are often high-functioning in certain domains, particularly domains that reward rationality and efficiency, and the absence of emotional disruption. But they pay a price that is not always visible from the outside. A kind of deadness at the center of their experience. A growing distance from everything that makes life feel meaningful. A brittleness that conceals itself until the weight of what has been suppressed finally becomes unsustainable. Neither extreme is mastery. Mastery is not found at either end of the spectrum. It is found in the integration, in the capacity to inhabit both the fullness of feeling and the freedom of non-attachment to feeling simultaneously. And this integration, while it sounds paradoxical, is achievable. It is, in fact, what the human capacity for consciousness makes available when that capacity is developed fully. The foundation of this integration is a shift in identity that is more radical than it might initially sound. The shift is from identifying yourself as your emotions to understanding yourself as the awareness in which your emotions arise. Most people, without examining it, experience their emotional states as identical to who they are. When they are angry, they are the anger. When they are afraid, they are the fear. When they are in grief, they are the grief. This identification is so complete and so automatic that the idea that there is something other than the emotion, something that is aware of the emotion without being identical to it, does not arise as a possibility. The emotion fills the entire field of awareness. There is no space left for the observer. The practice that builds this integration begins with the simple but profound act of noticing the observer. Not the emotion, not the thought about the emotion, not the story about why you are having the emotion. The part of you that is aware that an emotion is present. That awareness, that witnessing presence, is not the same as the emotion. It is what is watching the emotion. And the remarkable thing about that awareness is that it is never itself afraid or angry or hurt. It is simply present, simply aware. The fear is in the field of awareness. The anger is in the field of awareness. But the awareness itself is not the fear and not the anger. It is the space in which the fear and the anger are arising. This is not a mystical claim. It is a phenomenological observation about the structure of conscious experience. You can verify it right now, in this moment. Whatever you are feeling as you listen to this, whatever is present in your experience, notice that you are aware of it. Notice that there is something doing the noticing. Notice that the thing doing the noticing is not identical to what it is noticing. That is the observer. That is the awareness in which your experience is arising. And that awareness has a quality that the experiences it contains do not share. It is stable. It does not swing with the content. It does not expand when the feeling is positive and contract when the feeling is negative. It is simply present, steady, open, and available regardless of what arises within it. The capacity to rest in that awareness, to identify with the space rather than exclusively with its contents, is what makes it possible to feel fully without being controlled. Because from the position of awareness, the emotion can be felt completely. It does not need to be suppressed or managed or reduced. It can be felt in its full intensity, with nothing held back. Because the part of you that is feeling it is not the part that will make the decision about how to respond. The decision about how to respond comes from somewhere steadier, from the awareness, from the values that the awareness is built on, from the judgment that is accessible when the emotion is not also running the cognitive machinery. This is what the most disciplined people are doing often, without being able to articulate it explicitly when they feel everything and react to nothing. They are not suppressing the feeling. They are feeling it completely, from a position that is larger than the feeling. They are present to the anger or the fear or the grief or the longing in a way that honors its reality entirely, while simultaneously being present to something in them that is neither the anger nor the fear nor the grief, something that remains steady and available and capable of choosing, regardless of what the emotional weather system is doing. Developing this capacity requires practice in both directions simultaneously. Practice in allowing feeling more fully, in lowering the defensive structures that prevent the emotional experience from being received at its full depth, and practice in returning, again and again, to the position of the observer, not escaping from the feeling into detachment, not drowning in the feeling by abandoning the observer, but holding both the fullness of the feeling and the stability of the awareness at the same time. This is not easy. It is the most sophisticated thing the human capacity for self-awareness is capable of. But it is exactly what the title of this script describes. It is feeling everything, and it is reacting to nothing. Not because you are cold, because you are whole. Chapter 14. Building the identity of someone who does not break. Identity is the deepest level at which change is possible. Deeper than behavior, which changes most easily but reverts most quickly. Deeper than habit, which is more durable than behavior, but still rests on something more fundamental. Deeper than belief, which shapes both habit and behavior, but is itself shaped by something even more primary. Identity is the story you carry about who you are. At the core, the narrative you use to make sense of your choices, your responses, your values, and your place in the world. And because identity is the deepest level, it is also the level at which the most durable and the most significant change is possible. Change at the level of identity does not need to be maintained through effort in the way that behavioral change does. It simply expresses itself in the choices you make, in the way you carry yourself, in the quality of your presence in difficult moments. The project of this entire script has been, at its most fundamental, a project of identity construction. not the construction of a false identity, not the building of a persona or a performance or a mask, the construction of a genuine identity, the kind that is built not through declaration but through accumulated evidence of who you are when you are under pressure, the kind that does not need external validation because it is grounded in something you know from the inside, because you have been in the difficult moments, you have found the pause, you have felt the full weight of what was happening and chosen your response rather than being chosen by it. And the experience of doing that has deposited something in you that declarations and intentions never could. The person who does not break under pressure is not a person who is immune to pressure. They feel the pressure completely. They feel it in their body, in their thinking, in the place where certainty used to be and uncertainty now lives. The difference is in what the pressure meets when it arrives. When pressure arrives at a person whose identity is built on the foundation of genuine self-mastery, on the accumulated experience of having been in difficult moments and having found the center of themselves there, meets something solid, not something rigid, because rigidity breaks, something flexible that does not collapse. A tree in the wind rather than a wall in the wind. The wall can stand against moderate pressure and then fail suddenly and completely. The tree bends, sometimes dramatically, but returns to itself because its roots are deep enough to hold it through anything the wind can produce. Building this identity requires understanding what actually deposits in you through the consistent practice of emotional discipline over time. Because the deposit is not just functional. It is not just that you get better at finding the pause. The deposit is existential. It changes who you understand yourself to be. Every time you were in a moment where the reactive pattern would have run and you chose something different every time you found the breath, held the silence, felt the full force of the activation and let it inform, rather than command, you were building evidence. Evidence that you are the kind of person who can do that. Evidence that the gap is real and accessible and available to you in conditions of genuine difficulty. Evidence that who you are does not depend on circumstances remaining comfortable. This evidence accumulates into something that researchers in the field of positive psychology have called self-efficacy, the deep, experience-based confidence that you can handle what comes, not confidence based on things being fine. Confidence based on having been in things that were not fine and having found yourself adequate to them. This is completely different from the kind of confidence that many people pursue, the confidence that comes from external validation, from achievement and recognition, and the approval of others. That kind of confidence is always vulnerable to the next setback, the next criticism, the next failure, because it was built on something external to you, and therefore requires the continuation of that external source to be maintained. The identity of someone who does not break is not built on the outside. It is built on the inside, through specific experiences that cannot be faked or borrowed or purchased. You have to actually be in the difficult moment. You have to actually find the pause when the pause is hardest to find. You have to actually feel the thing that most strongly activates your reactive pattern and choose, deliberately and imperfectly, to respond from somewhere deeper than the pattern. And then you have to do that again, and again, and again, in different situations and under different kinds of pressure and with different specific triggers, activating different specific patterns, until the accumulated weight of all of those moments tips the balance of your identity from someone who hopes they can hold it together in difficult situations, to someone who knows from experience that they can. This process is not linear. There will be regressions. There will be moments where the reactive pattern runs completely, despite everything you have been practicing, where the press is too fast, or the trigger is too deep, or the exhaustion is too great for the trained response to compete with the automatic one. These moments are not failures. They are data. Specifically, they are the most valuable data. You have access to the clearest possible information about where the deep work still needs to happen, about which triggers are still below the level of conscious management, about what conditions make your capacity most vulnerable so that you can work specifically on those conditions. The person who treats their regressions as information rather than as verdicts about their character is the person who actually builds the identity over time. The person who treats every regression as proof that the project is failing, that they are fundamentally incapable of becoming who they are trying to become, is the person who gets stuck in cycles of effortful improvement, followed by discouragement, followed by abandonment, followed by a return to the starting point. The project is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You return to the same territory at different levels of development, and each time you pass through a particular challenge with a little more capacity than you had the last time, the identity builds another layer. The identity of someone who does not break is also not characterized by the absence of vulnerability. This is crucial. The person who has truly built this identity does not pretend to be invulnerable. They do not perform impenetrability. They are often remarkably open about their limitations, their struggles, their uncertainty, because their security does not depend on being seen as perfect or unaffected. Their security comes from a different source entirely. It comes from the knowledge that whatever comes, whatever difficulty, whatever criticism, whatever loss, whatever pressure, they have the internal resources to meet it, not to be unaffected by it, not to sail through it without cost, but to be adequate to it, to find within themselves what the moment requires, to not be less than what the situation asks of them, even when what the situation asks is very significant indeed. This is the identity worth building, not invulnerability, adequacy, the deep, experience-based knowledge that you are the kind of person who finds what they need in the difficult moments, the kind of person whose character deepens under pressure rather than shattering, the kind of person whose roots go deep enough that the wind, however fierce, does not uproot them. This identity is available to anyone who is willing to do the work that builds it. It cannot be inherited, cannot be performed, cannot be purchased. It can only be built, one difficult moment at a time, in the crucible of lived experience. Chapter 15. Living as the eye of the storm. There is a meteorological phenomenon that contains, in its physical structure, perhaps the most accurate metaphor for what emotional mastery at its fullest development actually looks like. The eye of the storm. The center of a hurricane is one of the most counterintuitive things in nature, a region of complete calm, surrounded by the most violent atmospheric forces on Earth. Inside the eye, the air is still. The sky is sometimes clear. There is a quality of almost unreal peace at the precise center of something that is, by every other measure, a catastrophe. And the thing that makes the eye possible is not isolation from the storm. It is the dynamic relationship between the forces at the center and the forces surrounding it. Remove the storm, and the I ceases to exist as a meaningful category. The calm is only the calm because of what surrounds it. The stillness only has its particular quality because of the intensity of the movement at its edges. The person who has built genuine emotional mastery is the eye of the storm, not someone removed from the intensity of life, not someone insulated from the difficulty, the pressure, the conflict, the grief, the frustration, and the full weight of human experience. Someone who is at the center of all of it, who feels all of it, the full force of the surrounding storm, and who maintains, not through effort or performance, but through the deep structural work that has been the subject of this entire script, a quality of stillness at their core that the storm cannot penetrate. This is not a destination that most people arrive at fully and finally and then maintain without further effort. It is a state that is practiced into being, moment by moment, choice by choice, pause by pause. It is more available on some days than others. It is more accessible in some conditions than others. It requires maintenance in the same way that any hard-won capacity requires maintenance through continued practice, continued self-awareness, continued willingness to do the work, even when the doing is difficult. But as the practice deepens, as the pause becomes more reliable, as the observer becomes more established, as the identity builds its layers of accumulated evidence, something begins to happen that is qualitatively different from what was possible at the beginning of the practice. The stillness stops being something you have to effortfully create and begins to be something you discover you already are. The peace stops being a technique and begins to be a way of being. The space between stimulus and response stops being something you have to fight for and begins to be something that is simply there, present, available, stable in a way that feels less like achievement and more like homecoming. Living as the eye of the storm does not mean that you are untouched by what happens around you. We established this at the very beginning, and it is worth closing with it. You feel everything. The losses land with their full weight. The conflicts carry their full charge. The frustrations are genuinely frustrating. The grief is genuinely grief. The anger, when it comes, is real. None of this is gone. None of this is bypassed. In fact, in many ways, having built the internal architecture that allows you to be fully present to your experience without being at its mercy makes you feel things more vividly, not less, because you are no longer partially checked out in the effort of managing or suppressing what is happening inside you. You are fully here for it, fully present, fully alive to the texture and the weight and the meaning of your experience in a way that the defended, reactive, perpetually braced version of yourself never quite was. What is different is not the feeling. What is different is the relationship to the feeling. You are no longer the leaf on the surface of the water, carried wherever the current goes. You are the water itself, moved by everything, carried by nothing. The events of your life happen in you, not to you. The emotions arise in the awareness, not as the awareness. The pressure activates the system, but the system does not collapse under the pressure, because the system has been built with something at its center that pressure cannot reach. Something steady, something chosen, something that has been earned moment by moment through the accumulated practice of being present to the full intensity of your experience and choosing your response rather than being chosen by it. The most disciplined people in the world are not people who have escaped from their humanity. They are people who have gone more deeply into their humanity than most people are willing to go, who have been willing to feel what is there to be felt, to face what is there to be faced, to do the unglamorous and internally demanding work of building a self that is adequate to whatever life produces. They carry a quality that you can feel when you are in their presence. A quality of settledness that has nothing to do with ease and everything to do with depth. A quality that communicates without words and without performance. That something real has been built here. That whatever you bring to this person, whatever pressure, whatever provocation, whatever difficulty, you are going to meet something that is genuinely, structurally not going to collapse. Not because they are cold, not because they do not care, but because they have done the work. Because they know who they are at the center of the storm. Because the I is real. And the peace at the center is earned. And nothing the storm produces can touch what lives there. This is not reserved for a particular type of person. It is not a gift distributed at birth to the lucky few. It is a capacity, built through practice, available to anyone willing to pay the price of its development in the currency of honest, sustained, unglamorous internal work. The work of noticing when you are reactive, before you have a chance to change anything. The work of building the physiological foundation that makes the pause possible. The work of training the pause in conditions of gradually increasing difficulty until it becomes reliable under real pressure. The work of shifting your identity from someone who hopes they can hold it together to someone who knows from evidence that they can. The work of feeling fully without being controlled. The work of being present to your experience rather than managed by it. You began this listening with a question, whether you knew you were asking it or not. The question every person carries who has ever watched someone hold their composure in a moment when they themselves would have fallen apart. The question of how. How do they do that? How does a person become someone who feels everything and reacts to nothing? How does a person build the eye of the storm inside themselves and learn to live from that center regardless of what the storm outside is doing? The answer is everything you have just heard. And the beginning of the answer, the first step of the practice, the first moment in which the person you are capable of becoming starts to displace the person you have been, is the next difficult moment you encounter. The next time something activates you. The next time the feeling arrives and the reflex pulls toward reaction, and somewhere in you there is now the possibility of a breath, a pause, a moment of awareness, a choice. That moment is the work. That moment, practiced thousands of times, is the transformation. That moment, accumulated into an identity, is the eye of the storm, and it is available to you. It always has been. You are simply, now, beginning to build it.